chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. The passage is part of a long section in which Jesus is trying to get the disciples to think about things in a new way. That is, after all, what the goal of a parable is all about, to surprise us and to often shake us up a bit so that we see God and we see the world a little differently. So to help us hear this parable a new way, Mike is having me use this somewhat chunky transition to listen, but listen and you will understand. From the chapter 18, the chapter of Luke. And Jesus even said this parable to some of those believing in themselves, that they are righteous and despising the rest. Two people went into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed these things. O God, give me thanks to you, and that I am not like the rest of these people, greedy, unrighteous, adulterers, or even like the tax collector. I fast 2 times between the Sabbaths. I give 1/10 of whatever I acquire. But the tax collector, standing at a distance, did not wish to raise his eyes to the heavens, but he beat his breast and said, O God, be merciful to me, I am a sinner. To you I say, going back down to the house, this one is justified alongside that one, because everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Thanks be to God for the surprising word of life.
On one level, that's kind of a simple story, right? I mean, it's about a guy walking down the street after somebody else. But in the context of modern American culture, it's complicated. On one level, there's nothing really funny about the story. It's one person following another down the street. But from the moment that the woman looks over her shoulder and sees a black man following her, the whole thing changes. But of course, Michael Jr., the guy on the street in the story, doesn't recognize the racial dynamic, and Michael Jr., the comedian, does, and so the whole thing plays out in an interesting way. I really wonder what it would be like to listen to this story with sort of like different eyes, with eyes that didn't share a modern American cultural assumptions about such things. It would be really great if there was somebody from another country here today. Anybody from completely another country that doesn't share these ideas? Sam Akumbi, is that you? Where are you from? Angola?
Africa, Southern Africa.
Southern Africa. Come up here for a minute. So you just saw this video, right? What do you make of it?
Well, the first thing for me is that there are 2 different perceptions. And that different perception needed to be clarified. This is my first.
Okay, so why is it funny?
It's funny because there are 2 things that were not discovered. People were laughing, but without discovering the bottom line of that jogging.
And the bottom line of the jogging
is actually not understanding why someone is running after other person, looking back, increasing the path toward another person, but without understanding why the other person in front of the other person is running.
Yeah, exactly. So So we went through this a little bit downstairs before the service. And Luis mentioned 3 things about the story, about the video, without even mentioning the racial dynamic that was involved. He talked about how it was interesting that the man was running behind and there's somebody else running behind them, and that unacknowledged person supposedly behind them added a bit of humor to the story. And because he doesn't share American cultural assumptions about racism, it didn't even strike him that the linchpin to the whole thing as far as comedy goes is the irony of the character in the story not recognizing that the woman is running because a black man is following her. So you can go ahead and sit down for a while, Luis. I'm going to call you back up later to bring greetings, but you can go ahead and sit for now. Our cultural assumptions really shape the way that we hear things. How wonderful it would be to be able to listen to that story, to listen to that joke, and in a sense not get it. Because we didn't immediately think, oh, there's a black man running after a white woman, so of course she's afraid. What if our culture didn't teach us that that was the normal reaction and we could see things differently? Our cultural assumptions shape the way that we see things in so many unacknowledged ways. And that is true for the New Testament world as well. I wanted to show you that video today because you like me more when I make you laugh during a sermon. No, that wasn't the reason. No, not really. Yeah, that was the reason. No, that wasn't the reason. No, I wanted to show it to you today to reveal this dynamic about cultural assumptions. If we don't immediately understand the racial dynamic of the story, it's like not even funny, really. But of course, it would be pretty impossible to be raised in the modern United States with our sad history and present reality of race relations and not immediately get the racial undertones and therefore see the irony and therefore see it as funny. Our cultural assumptions, our cultural background shape the way we see the story. And of course, the same thing, as I said, is true for the way that we hear stories in the New Testament. The same thing was true for the way that stories were told at the time of the New Testament. The cultural assumptions of Jews in first century Palestine shape the stories that Jesus told, and they shape the way that we understand, or that they understood those stories in their own day. So the stories that Jesus tells, we call them parables now, meant something in that first century context. And to really get what Jesus was saying, to really get maybe the tension of what Jesus is saying, we have to start with what those cultural assumptions were. Now, the problem, of course, is that none of us, including me, are exactly experts on first century Judaism. And honestly, in the absence of solid historical understanding, what we do is we tend to fill in the gaps with our own cultural assumptions, which often lead us in a very different direction than what Jesus intended. So to show you what I mean, I wanted to give you another visual aid today, and that is the picture on the front of your worship order today. So the picture there on the front of the worship order is one among dozens of images that came up when I typed the keywords tax collector Pharisee into the Google Images search engine. So this picture is consistent with all of the other pictures that were mentioned, that were shown. I only used this one because I thought it was just visually the most clear. But to put it simply, this picture and all of those other pictures that showed up on Google Images don't get the cultural assumptions of the story in Jesus' day. To put it simply, pictures like this and all the other ones are wrong at best and anti-Semitic at worst. The Pharisee here, obviously on the right-hand side with his nice big red robe on, looks fat, smug, and self-righteous. And probably not accidentally, he looks very much like most European depictions of Jews in the 18th and in the 18 and 1900s, including tragically most Nazi images of Jews leading up to the Holocaust. The problem is that those are our stereotypes and don't reveal how people in the first century thought about Pharisees. And it certainly isn't how Jesus and his contemporaries thought about themselves, because they were all Jews. Why would they make themselves look like this? So in the story itself, as Tom mentioned, the somewhat clunky translation that I had him read earlier, the story itself says that there's really nothing wrong with the Pharisee saying that he's not like other people. He keeps the law, and that's a good thing. Keeping the law is a good thing. Jesus himself says, you should do everything the law requires. He specifically and openly, the Pharisee specifically and openly gives God the credit for the fact that he follows the law. He acknowledges that it's only because of God's grace that he lives the life that he does. He's not taking credit for it. He's giving God the credit for it. He begins, I thank you, God. You know, think of it this way. He's like a football player in a post-game interview after a game-winning touchdown saying, I just thank God that I was in the right place at the right time and I was able to help my team. You know, that doesn't sound all self-righteous, does it? The Pharisee did what God wanted, and he thanks God for it. You know, good for him. Furthermore, if you understand the first century context in which the story was written, you realize that the Pharisee, like the football player, was happy to do it for the team. Or at least he should have been. That's what the audience would have expected of a Pharisee. Judaism is and was a very communal faith. My goodness, or lack thereof, affects everyone else in the community. Just as one person's sin can stain a whole community, so one person's righteousness can be a blessing to the whole community. And if that sounds a little strange, or maybe it strikes you as legalistic, remember that that's precisely the kind of thing that is behind our sharing in the death and resurrection of Jesus. The cross works salvation in part because Jesus' faithfulness allows others to be justified. It's that communal nature of goodness that results from God's grace. So, the Pharisee here in this picture is really a caricature, but to start out with, he's, in the context of the story, a good caricature, not a bad one. He fasts more than the law requires of him, and he gives away way more money than the law requires of him. He's building up a huge pile of goodness, not just for himself, but for the whole community. And again, he gives thanks to God that he's able to do this because of his faithfulness. All of that helps us understand why the Pharisees were the good guys in Jesus' day. Their faithfulness helped everyone. Now, I don't mean to say, however, that the Pharisee in the story is acting properly in every dynamic of the story, because it's complicated. You can't really see it in this small size picture that you have with you on the worship order, but if you could blow this up and look at a larger version of it, you would see that the Pharisee is actually looking askance back at the tax collector. His eyes are actually not pointed toward heaven like it says in the story, but rather his eyes are looking back askance at the tax collector, and thus the plot thickens. This picture, largely misses it in its portrayal of the tax collector as well, just like it misses it with regard to the Pharisee. The tax collector in this picture looks like he's dressed in rags, he's thin, he's weak, he's clearly meant to look like an outcast from society. And the image immediately builds sympathy for this guy, right? Sympathy for a tax collector, which first century Jews would not have had at all. Tax collectors were at the top of the food chain, not the bottom. They were the rich ones who could get what they wanted when they wanted. If anything, the clothing of the two in this picture should be reversed, with the tax collector dressed to the nines and the Pharisee in everyday basic humble clothing. To most people, the tax collectors were the sellouts, the collaborators with Rome. But tax collecting was a necessary function. Romans demanded that Jews pay taxes, and Jews would rather have Jews collect the tax rather than the Roman guards, because they're likely to be treated a little bit better in the process. Still, the people blamed the tax collectors for selling out to the Romans, and of course, abuses were common in the midst of this. So, people would have been shocked to hear of a tax collector in the temple praying for forgiveness with real fervor and depth of heart. They would have been shocked and a little skeptical about the tax collector. What was the tax collector really up to here? Is he really going to change? Can he be trusted? To get the cultural signals right, to recognize the difference between our world and the world of first century Jews, the cultural signals, the kind of depth of cultural signals that's involved in what I said about the video, it would probably be a more faithful image if we had a very faithful-looking nun thanking God that she is able to serve the poor. Nothing wrong with that, right? And a Wall Street executive in a $3,000 suit in the background asking for forgiveness. You probably wouldn't be very shocked to see the nun looking a little skeptically at the executive. And that's when we can begin to see the story for what's really going on. The guy whose goodness has blessed the community the Pharisee, is not sure that he wants that blessing to be wasted on the guy who has, at least up until now, been destructive of the community. You know, let's wait and see about this guy. Let's see if the allegedly repentant tax collector quits collecting taxes, sells his $3,000 Italian suit, gives the money to the poor, and starts actually being a blessing to the community rather than a drag on the community. But Jesus is having none of it. At the end of the story, he says, as they go back to their houses, the second one is right with God, just like the first one. As they go back to their houses, the tax collector is right with God, just like the Pharisee. God's grace is just splashed over this whole situation. In spite of the tax collector's past, in spite of the Pharisee's present, both the guys are right with God, and the community is made whole again because of the grace of God being poured lavishly on both of them. And with that, the parable ends, and the tension of the story is really thrown back right into our laps. What do we make of this Pharisee? This good guy who is thankful for God's grace that allows him to live an honorable life, but he's not sure he's ready to be brothers with his frenemy. And what about the tax collector? Is he really going to change? Do people ever really change? Will we embrace him if he does? Will we embrace him even if he doesn't? We can accept that God has set us all right with God, but can we accept that God has set all of us right with God? Even when appearances show that someone doesn't deserve it? Or forget appearances, even when they don't deserve it? Amy Jill Levine, who is a scholar of the New Testament from the Jewish tradition, who I have been relying upon really for much of the thinking of this sermon, brings this parable home with a modern analogy. So imagine yourself back in middle school or high school, I suppose. And I guess that you all know the situation in which you have been lumped with a group of other people to do a class project. You know, the class is divided up into groups. You've got yourself and 3 others, and together you have to get this project done. And you, and I bet this is the case for many of you, are probably the smart one in the group. And you're used to getting things done. So you do your background research and you make sure that the project is going to come off. And you get a little help from somebody else who's working on this project, somebody who at least is willing to host you in their house and serve treats to go along with it. Or maybe you got somebody else in the group who's really good with the visuals that are going to be required. You provide all the brains, but they provide all the flash, and it's great, and you're real happy with their contribution. But you know that there's somebody else in the group who's not going to contribute a darn thing, right? You know that there's going to be a slacker who doesn't do anything to benefit the community. And you also know that when you get your grade, they're going to get an A just like you did for the work that you did, not the work that they did. If you remember what that feels like, you'll remember what the Pharisee feels like in this story. Can we accept that God is just as gracious to that slacker as God is to us? Can we be thankful that God's given us the ability, the interest, the background, the skills to contribute to the great human project of living out God's love in this world? And that same grace applies to the person who might not be contributing as much as we think they ought to be. Can we do away with our cultural assumptions about Pharisees and tax collectors and who deserves God's love and who doesn't, and just bask in the grace of God that showers down upon us all? Can we accept for everyone God's grace? In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.